be having as good time as they're having out there. All right, so I'm going to talk about miseducating a non-existent citizen. And I mean both of those things. I think that what we do in the university at large, is a kind of miseducation, and I think it's largely on behalf of a citizen or type of citizen that I don't think actually exists. And so what I want to talk about today is just, how this came to be and what it consists of, and uncover some of the fallacies that I think are involved in our current undergraduate education system. Our current system of undergraduate education exists as a whole, in my view, without a compelling rationale. Some elements of its mission are simply incoherent, while others, though coherent, can only be justified on a much smaller scale. This situation cannot be attributed solely to our failure to understand the proper uses of classroom and book learning and our social, economic, civic, and personal needs, though I think there are a great many professors and administrators who suffer this sort of failure in understanding. In truth, the number of socially, economically, and civically relevant uses of the sorts of learning that are best provided in a college or university setting is quite small. It is mostly the product of a combination of deliberate dishonesty, I'm sorry to say, and unwitting self-deception, not merely on the part of those charged with providing higher education, who certainly have any number of conscious and unconscious interests in the current system, but on the part of the general public. The situation, in short, is one for which we are all, to some degree, at fault. For higher education, and to a greater extent education as a whole, is a mirror, in which we see ourselves not as we actually are, but rather as we like to think that we are. Our conception of education, after all, is based on our conception of who and what we currently are, who and what we have been, and what we in our society need. A faulty conception of education then suggests a faulty conception of self, which means that in order to develop the kinds of institutions of primary, secondary, and post-secondary education that might benefit us as individuals and as a society, we must first have a frank conversation about who and what we are and about the kind of society in which we actually live. My primary aim here today will be to expose the commonly given rationales for our current system of higher education as the flimsy things they are, and in doing so, bring to light the mistaken views of our society and ourselves that lie underneath. My approach will largely be conceptual and philosophical, which means that I will be more interested in what is presupposed and implied by our current educational institutions and practices, that is, with the essential logic that they represent, than I will be with the social science, such that it is, that has informed those responsible for creating and maintaining them. All right, so before we get started, let's identify the ends or mission of our current system of undergraduate education and the way in which our colleges and universities are fulfilling its first mission itself. And I've broken this down into three pieces. First, to educate people for virtually every non-blue-collar profession, from administrative assistant to brain surgeon. 2, to prepare people to be active participants in civil society and political life. 3, to contribute to the personal growth and development of young people. I have not just invented these, I've culled these from surveying literally hundreds of university website mission statements and also reading quite a bit of educational statements that theorists have made on behalf of the current system. It is worth noting that these elements do not differ in any significant way from those described by T.S. Eliot in the Lectures on Education that he delivered at the University of Chicago in 1950. Although there is one key difference. Eliot is speaking mainly of primary and secondary education, not post-secondary education. Now this is devastating enough in itself. What does it say about us and the education we offer to our young today that we cannot credibly say that 12 years of primary and secondary schooling is sufficient to be a competent citizen or to develop as persons? And for many critics, the chief problem with undergraduate education today is that too much of it is spent learning things that should have been learned in primary and secondary school. Still, although the lack of rigor in K-12 education and the post-secondary education sprawl that inevitably follows are certainly concerns, they are not the problem. It might be true that too many people are earning bachelor's degrees today, and I think that far too many are earning bachelor's degrees. But the reason they are doing so is not because their primary and secondary educations were insufficiently rigorous. The real reasons, in fact, lie deeper than this and have to do with our very conception of what sorts of knowledge and skills personal, professional, and civic virtue require in the type of society that we live in today and given the kind of people that we are. The key to understanding the current university and its problems lies in understanding liberal education and the role that it is supposed to play with respect to the threefold mission described. Indeed, it is not an exaggeration to say that liberal education is the reason for our current system of higher education. No one denies that the professions our young people will enter as adults require some amount of formal study, or even that the amount required has increased in the wake of industrialization and will continue to do so, as our science and technology grow more advanced and are implicated in a greater and greater portion of our lives. But this by itself tells us nothing about the context in which this schooling should take place, or what beyond a narrow job-related course of study should be included. Similarly, everyone agrees that good citizenship and personal development require some combination of knowledge and character, but this also begs the question of the manner in which such traits are acquired and in what setting their acquisition ought to take place. Our current system of higher education reveals that we think that all of these ends are best served by baccalaureate education, that professional training and personal and civic development are best acquired in the context of a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science degree, in which a course of specialized study, the major, is taken against a backdrop of generalized courses in intellectual skills, which beyond reading, writing, and the capacity to understand basic mathematics, mainly means a capacity for what's called critical thinking, elementary natural and social science, fine arts, and humane letters, the combination of which is commonly known as general education, and the educational result of which is described as being liberally educated. It is easy to make the mistake of thinking that this general course of study is of tertiary significance, and students, faculty, and administration often act as if it is. But in fact, it is absolutely primary, since the only reason why any prospective accountant, nurse, or civil engineer in America is getting a bachelor's degree, rather than some sort of technical certificate, is because we believe that in order to be a good accountant, nurse, civil engineer, etc., as well as a good person and a good citizen, one must be liberally educated. The university, as it exists in its current form, then, exists because of liberal education and only because of liberal education. So what's at the heart of this course of study, this general course of study, the result of which is a liberally educated person? Well, with the exception of the smattering of natural and social science and elementary writing, mathematics, and other skills courses just mentioned, it is essentially a course in the Western canon. That is, in the classic literature, philosophy, theology, and fine arts of the Mediterranean Rim, Europe, and North America, spanning from antiquity through the modern era, up through the 19th century. Notably, I'll get back to this later, it typically does not include much by way of contemporary, i.e. 20th century, arts and letters. We are told by education experts, college and university administrators, and politicians, and we tell ourselves and our teens that such an education is absolutely necessary if we are to have skilled and ethical professionals, competent and involved citizens, and fully developed individual persons. And this necessity is then cited as the primary rationale for universal higher education and for the gigantic and gigantically expensive system of colleges and universities that is required to administrate it. The question, of course, is whether any of this is true. Whether young people really do require this sort of education in order to make a living, be good citizens, and enjoy a personally satisfying life. Or whether such an education is even really useful towards these ends. And it is this question that I turn to the next and lengthiest part of my address today. So that comes the critique. The central point of my critique is that the rationales that are typically offered on behalf of universal higher liberal education are grounded in two fundamental mistakes. First, a mistaken conception of how certain desirable character traits are acquired. And second, a mistaken conception of the present state of the individual person and citizen, and of his or her relationship to the society in which he or she lives, and the society itself. By society, I mean to include economic, social, and political dimensions of our lives. I'm going to go through these in order. I'm going to go through the argument from professional competence and virtue. I'm going to go through the argument from civic virtue, and I'm going to go through the argument from personal development. Okay? Sort of criticize each of these. So first, the argument for professional competence and virtue. I don't know that anyone has actually gone so far as to say that one must be liberally educated in order literally to earn a living. It's probably wise that nobody actually says that, since it's demonstrably preposterous in its face. But it is widely, perhaps universally, believed that in order to be a good accountant, nurse, engineer, entrepreneur, etc., one must have, beyond the obvious sorts of professional competencies, two characteristics which it is alleged a liberal education helps to provide. The first being the capacity for something called critical thinking, which is hazily defined as the possession of a certain kind of practical rationality, and the second being ethics, which is even more hazily defined, but which is typically intended to mean that the professional in question is not inclined to cheat or otherwise mistreat those people whom he employs as labor or whom he serves as customers in his capacity as a provider of goods and services. What we are being asked to believe, then, is that a liberal education produces sharp, morally decent professionals. An idea, to be fair, that is not merely an invention of contemporary advocates of higher education, but is one that has some history behind it. John Stuart Mill, in an 1867 inauguration speech given prior to his becoming Lord Rector of the University of St. Andrews, said that, quote, "Whether those whose specialty they are will make a wise and conscientious use of them or the reverse, depends less on the manner in which they are taught their profession than upon what sorts of minds they bring to it, what kind of intelligence and of conscience the general system of education has developed in them." If we take the calls for universal higher liberal education seriously, we must realize, however, that the argument being made by contemporary higher education advocates is the even stronger one. That but for the kind of general education and skills in the Western canon provided by today's universities, we wouldn't and won't have competent or morally decent professionals. Is there any reason to think that this is true in either its weak or strong form? I doubt it. In fact, I would maintain that there are a number of very strong reasons for thinking that it's false. One is that practical reason and moral virtue are not products of book and classroom learning, or for that matter, of the possession of knowledge of any kind. And to think that they are is to fundamentally misunderstand both. Another is that there simply is no case to be made, whether empirical or a priori, for the idea that the sort of aesthetic and cultural knowledge provided by a liberal education produces more professionally prudent or ethical people. Excellence in practical reasoning, or as is more commonly called today, deliberation, is a species of wisdom, not knowledge. And wisdom is both acquired and exercised in praxis, not in the receipt or dissemination of information. Put another way, you get better at making choices and decisions by making choices and decisions, not by being taught logic or by being given a list of formal and informal fallacies. And the reason is that the ability to deliberate is a kind of knowing how rather than knowing that, a distinction first drawn in the last century by Gilbert Ryle, the great ordinary language philosopher from Oxford. The rules of practical reasoning describe sound deliberation, they do not instigate it. So the usefulness of such rules in producing good deliberators, and thus of what can be taught in a classroom, is minimal and indirect. They provide general instances of good reasoning and nothing more. Of course, the ability to make good professional choices does depend on the possession of some knowledge, but only of the kind that one must have to engage in the profession in the first place. Obviously, one can't make good medical or engineering choices without knowing a great deal about medicine and engineering. Much the same point applies to the development of moral virtue. We must remember that the word ethics comes from the Greek word ethikos, which has as its root ethos, which means habit. Like excellence in deliberation, from which it derives, Aristotle describes moral and civic virtue as the products of successful deliberation in the social and civic spheres of life. Moral virtue is acquired and exercised in praxis. It is true that many, perhaps most people, think that being morally decent in one's professional and other affairs is a kind of instruction following, a matter of a kind of following instructions. But this is only because they misunderstand the nature and purpose of moral canons like the Hebraic law or the moral rules that one derives from secular moral philosophies. Like the canons of practical reason, moral rules only describe moral behavior, they don't create it, which means that being versed in them, even memorizing them to the last letter, will never be sufficient for being a decent person. This is true not simply because of the nature of canons and rules, but because being morally decent in one's affairs is not a matter of knowledge, but of inclination, of right sentiment. And this is only developed as a matter of habit. Now, we've known this since antiquity, specifically since Aristotle refuted the Socratic assertion and the Protagoras that to know the good is to be good, and conversely that to be bad is the result of some deficiency in knowledge. But nonetheless, for some reason, we continue to think and act as if being good is the result of rule following, and is therefore something that can be taught in a classroom. And I'll leave it to the anthropologists and sociologists to figure out why on earth we continue to stubbornly insist upon this point, even though we don't know it's not true. Now, all of this speaks to the general question of whether anything that you could teach in a classroom would produce competent and ethical professionals. And I have maintained that there really is nothing, or at best very little, that we could do in the classroom that would have such an effect. But let's remember that the suggestion currently under consideration is a much bolder, much more specific one. It is that an education in the Western canon, plus a smattering of skills courses, is both necessary and sufficient for the production of qualified, decent professionals. Now, this just strikes me as being demonstrably false. So much so, in fact, that it borders on the incredible that anyone would suggest it. I mean, does anyone really believe that if our businessmen would just read more Kant and Mill, we would have fewer corporate scandals and crimes? Right? If Ken Lay had just read, right, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, that he wouldn't have robbed 80 million senior citizens' pension funds. Right? Does anybody really believe that if our politicians just read more Greek and modern political philosophy, that we would have better governance? It's not just that these suggestions sound absurd, which of course they do, but that we have every reason to doubt their validity. For one thing, the literate, cultured villain is a long-standing cultural trope, which is, as all such tropes are, based in reality. I can come up with dozens of examples of brilliant, genius, bad people, both in reality and in fiction. But for another thing, consider the fact that the sorts of businessmen and politicians whose professional indecency has given rise to our concerns about professional ethics are the most likely to have had precisely the sort of education that is being suggested as an antidote to professional malfeasance. I guarantee you that all of these major national crooks have all been liberally educated. Okay? I mean, they all went to top universities. They took a liberal arts curriculum. Okay? So the notion that somehow the liberal arts curriculum is some antidote to being a crook is just demonstrably ridiculous. All right, let's talk about the argument from civic virtue, the citizenship argument. Other than the argument for professional competence and virtue, the case most often made on behalf of our current system of higher education for making it universal is that it is fundamental to citizenship in a participatory democracy. That if we want people to play an active part in civil society and government, they must be liberally educated. And like the argument for professional competence and virtue, a version of this argument can also be found in sort of classic writings on the subject and in Mill's inaugural address at the University of St. Andrews. I'll just give you the quote. He says, quote, "It is thus too that minds are formed capable of guiding and improving public opinion on the greater concerns of practical life. Government and civil society are the most complicated of all subjects accessible to the human mind, and he who would deal competently with them as a thinker and not as a blind follower of a party requires not only a general knowledge of the fleeting facts of life, both moral and material, but an understanding, exercise, and discipline in the principles and rules of sound thinking up to a point which neither the experience of life nor any one science or branch of knowledge affords." Unquote. Specifically, I guess the argument is supposed to go something like this. People in a society like ours are free, rational actors whose decisions determine who will govern them and what form that governance will take, i.e. what sorts of laws and institutions they will be governed by, as well as what products and services private industry will provide. It is crucial then, so the argument goes, that they are good enough citizens as to want to participate and to do so in a productive and constructive manner, and that they have sufficient critical thinking skills and general education to participate well. That is, to make good economic and financial choices, select competent ethical political representatives, and support good legislation and civic and political institutions. The argument, in short, takes as its backdrop all of the assumptions and principles that characterize modern liberal political and economic thought as manifested in the work of classical political and economic theorists like John Locke, Adam Smith, the signers of the American Constitution, and in the writings of their 20th century progeny, including the rational choice theorists in economics, and in political philosophy, most significantly, John Rawls. And so it sort of assumes this picture of the individual rational actor engaging the economy, engaging the society, polity. Now, at one level, my criticisms here are the same as my criticisms of the argument for professional competence and virtue. The desired social characteristics to which the argument from civic virtue refers are simply varieties of excellence in deliberation and moral virtue, and as we've already demonstrated, these are not traits that are required by way of education of any kind, in the sense of classroom learning. Now, some may want to suggest that the civic and political virtue required by participatory democracy is a distinct species of virtue from the kinds of moral virtue that are desirable in the personal and professional spheres of life. But here I have to agree with Eliot, who maintained that any such conception of civic or political virtue is at best obscure and at worst hopelessly problematic. Would we call a person a good citizen who competently and actively supported society, even if the society and its aims were wicked in nature? Would we call a person a good citizen who competently and actively supported an ethical society if he was wicked in his own personal affairs? As Eliot says of the citizen in a participatory democracy, quote, he must be adapted to it, certainly, for without being adapted to it, he cannot play a part in it. But he must not be completely adapted to it in the form in which he finds it around him, for that would train a generation to be completely incapable of change or improvement. Quote. The good citizen, it seems then, must act in support of his society when it's good, but must work against it when it is bad. Furthermore, he must be good in his private and professional affairs, for it would be absurd to describe a person who is malicious and vicious in his private life as a good citizen, regardless of how he behaved publicly. And so it seems that there really is no useful distinction to be made between the good person and the good citizen, which is why I tend to agree with Eliot that the good citizen, quote, is simply the good man manifesting his goodness in the social context, unquote. And that consequently, the manner in which a good citizen is produced is no different from the manner in which goodness is developed more generally at the personal and professional levels of our being. We see then that the argument from civic virtue suffers many of the same problems that the argument from professional competence and virtue suffers. But there are also a number of problems that are distinctive to the civic virtue argument. And I want to discuss a few of them here today, because they sandwich our current self-deception, both with respect to our identities as individuals and our identity as a society. This is sort of the heart of the matter. With respect to the individual, the idea that we engage both the economy and the polity as rational actors and competent evaluations of cost-benefit analyses and other rational principles has been rendered so problematic by 19th and 20th century thought that it is hard to believe that anyone other than the rankest propagandist is still advancing it. Part of the problem is that the classical liberal picture of the rational actor depends essentially on the Cartesian idea that one's thoughts and thus one's reasons for belief and for action are transparent to oneself. That is, that we actually know with a high degree of certainty what our reasons for belief and acting are. Yet it is difficult to credit this idea in light of the critiques of Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, and others who have argued, and in my view demonstrated beyond any real doubt, that our reasons for believing what we do and acting in the manner that we do are tangled, conflicted, largely non-rational, often vicious, even animalistic, and regardless, are largely obscure to us without extraordinary and extended investigation. That is, the manifest reasons for why we believe and act as we do are not the real reasons, and the real reasons are largely hidden from us and involve motivations and passions that are anything but those of the disinterested rational actor, the image of which has fueled the fantasies of the Descartes, Kants, Locke's, Smiths, and Rawlses of the world. Add to this, I haven't even mentioned the worst enduring psychological paradigm of the last century, behaviorism, according to which individuals are not even actors at all, let alone rational ones, but rather complex stimulus response mechanisms whose behavior is determined by nothing more than our native genetic endowment and our experience of sensory stimulation, and the human image presupposed by the civic virtue argument comes across not just as fantasy, but absurdist fantasy. Now, it's easy to try to dismiss these sorts of considerations as mere theorizing, except for the fact that the world in which we live largely bears them out. Put another way, both our economy and our polity now conceive of and engage the individual in precisely the way that has been suggested by the critics of the classical liberal human image. And it is a conception that has granted businesses and politicians immeasurable wealth and power, a fact that would suggest that their view is largely true. In other words, if it wasn't true, it wouldn't work. Our businesses do not serve their customers by engaging their clear, rational self-conception of what they want and need, and then serving it. They aggressively create desire for whatever it is that they want to sell. A fascinating example of this is the marketing campaign designed by Edward Bernays, the creator of the field of public relations, and the first to employ the principles of crowd psychology and Freudian psychoanalysis in business. This advertising campaign convinced women to take up smoking in the early 20th century. This man single-handedly, using Freudian principles and crowd psychology, convinced American women to start smoking, and also convinced everyone else to accept women's smoking, which at the time was completely taboo. He did this through manipulation and social management, not by engaging rational actors. This is a fiction. And people in business know it's a fiction. Similarly, politicians do not follow the rationally conceived and deliberated upon desires and needs of the public. They aggressively manage public opinion in order to, as Walter Lippmann described it, manufacture consent for the policies that they and the experts they employ have already decided are best. As Bernays put it in his revealing and devastatingly honest manifesto on social and civic control, propaganda, and I highly recommend people read this. If, quote, if we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing it? The recent practice of propaganda has shown that it is possible, unquote. The ugly truth is that we do not live in a participatory democracy based on classical liberal principles, and have not since at least the full flowering of the industrial age. Rather, we live in a technocracy as part of a mass public that is managed, not governed or served, by cadres of highly sophisticated psychologists and social scientists whose chief managerial instruments are bureaucracies, large-scale business concerns, and multimodal media enterprises, which operate by a combination of Freudian and behaviorist principles under a facade of classical liberal institutions and traditional business enterprises, the public's belief in which is engendered and maintained by mass public education, mass higher education, and by a shallow but effective patriotism. And actually, this is all quite explicit. If you actually read the early documents arguing on behalf of founding a public school system, they very explicitly state that the purpose is to acculturate people to participate in the economy. And to be obedient to political authority. This is not a secret. Now, for those for whom the preceding argument is a bit too radical, and that's fair. I mean, this is a pretty radical statement. Let me make a few observations of a more modest kind, which amount to essentially the same point. Right? The point is that the argument from civic virtue presupposes a citizen that simply doesn't exist. Okay? And so let me make a few more modest observations in this direction if this last bit was a bit too radical. Okay? Look, the model of liberal education that's being touted as essential for good citizenship essentially belongs to an earlier era, to a pre-industrial society in which the franchise was limited to a natural aristocracy, that's what they called it, of landowners. The omnipresent bureaucracy and civil service that we currently have did not exist. The world of commerce consisted primarily of small business operations with minimal and unsophisticated marketing and advertising, and in which consequently the idea of self-determination and self-rule was a far more substantive and credible one for the people that were self-determining and self-ruling. It was reasonable to suggest then that this natural aristocracy, which was responsible not just for governing, but for determining the general character of the larger culture, required a common cultural background and formal education. And it should be noted, by the way, that their liberal education was far more substantial and rigorous than ours, including notably heavy instruction in Greek and Latin language and literature, which our students would choke on if you even tried to suggest that they should do this now. The problem is it's simply not possible to make a similar case for the relevance of this sort of education today. Living as we do in an industrial mass society where governance is overwhelmingly affected by career bureaucrats and civil servants and by professional politicians, and where the culture is set by enormous corporate media conglomerates concentrated in New York and Los Angeles. Political participation today, even at the local levels, especially at the local levels, is largely superficial, consisting of little more than infrequent voting and perhaps, for a tiny number of people, some limited political activism. And yet, we are supposed to believe that this barely invested, thinly conceived citizen requires an education in Aeschylus, Shakespeare, Descartes, Locke, and the like, lest their participation, such as it is, might suffer. The suggestion is beyond incredible, it is preposterous. Now, one of my interlocutors, I've been tossing this back and forth with a bunch of people, one of my interlocutors has made a very interesting suggestion. If a liberal education cannot support the individual and the citizen in his or her engagement with the economy and the state because of its largely technocratic nature and the diminished agency that has come with it, perhaps it might play a restorative role instead. That is, perhaps it might play a role in which the task is to return a greater degree of autonomy to the individual and the citizen in response and in opposition to the current technocratic society. In short, the proposal is that liberal education should be reconceived as essentially countercultural. Okay? Now, I have to admit to being sympathetic to this idea, if only because it's the only thing I've heard proposed that even has a remote chance of being conceptually sound. But I must also admit to being skeptical of its practicality, for I find it very difficult to believe that our current colleges and universities, or at least any significant number of them, will be either willing or able to play this sort of role in our society. Let me say a few things on behalf of the idea, because I think it's worth considering. For liberal education to serve a countercultural role in today's world, it would have to be a radically different curriculum. It would have to emphasize late 19th and early 20th century arts and letters, and particularly those that serve what I would describe as demystifying, debunking, unmasking sorts of functions. Works of the likes of Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, the later Wittgenstein, Foucault, Huxley, Orwell, the German Expressionists, etc. Why do I say this? Well, the traditional Western canon is essentially humanistic. It consists of literature and arts that describe and celebrate a deeply and richly rendered human being, and which are devoted to identifying the place of that human being in a world that is at least ideally designed for us. The world we live in today is not designed for such a human being. And our current state, that diminished state of individual social, economic, and political agency, can only be described as post-human. We have a kind of world and are a kind of human being, then, about which the Western canon has little to say. But beyond the simple and obvious point, let me suggest two reasons why traditional liberal education is inappropriate if our ends are essentially countercultural. First, if a countercultural liberal education is to be essentially restorative in nature, that is, if its purpose is to return agency to the individual and the citizen, right, then its main task must be to undo the social, economic, and political control under which we fall, to counter the work of the Lippmanns, Bernays, Skinners, and others who have helped to construct the system of social management that currently obtains and which has rendered us in our current post-human state. Now, this cannot be accomplished by pointing to what personhood used to mean, by talking about what we used to be, but only by exposing the mechanisms of mystification and control that have determined what personhood currently means and what we currently are, so that their effects can be countered and perhaps broken. Second, to continue teaching the Western canon and to allow it to be co-opted as it currently is into universal baccalaureate education is to allow the illusion to be maintained that our society is in fact a classical liberal participatory democracy and free market, and that in our engagement with it we really are free rational agents. In short, by teaching the Western canon and the university as it currently stands, we are facilitating the facade and thereby supporting the very technocracy against which we are supposed to be fighting. And with respect to my skepticism about the practicality of the suggestion, the countercultural liberal arts, obviously, the universities and colleges are so heavily invested in private industry and government that there simply is no chance, really, that there's going to be any sort of systematic or substantive countercultural role attributed to the university. That might have been true for a few years in the 60s. It's not going to be true now. Okay, I have a few minutes left. Let me just say one or two things about the personal growth and development argument, and then I'll close. I don't have much to say about the personal growth and development argument, mostly because it's never made in the absence of the previous two arguments. In other words, nobody says, oh, well, the reason we should have billions and billions of dollars worth of undergraduate institutions is so that people can personally grow and develop. Nobody says that. They say the other two things. We need it for citizenship, we need it so that we won't have criminal crooks running our businesses. And then they sort of tack on the personal development argument as sort of cream, sort of icing on the cake. And also, it contributes to personal growth. So I don't want to say much about it because I think it's sort of an add-on argument. But let me say something else about it. One other thing about it. I mean, even if everyone were to agree that a liberal education is a part of a person's satisfying life, right? It's difficult to imagine anyone sort of wanting to extend that argument universally, right? I mean, people like different things. People find different things fulfilling. I mean, people obtain pleasure and fulfillment from there are as many sources of pleasure and fulfillment as there are kinds of people. And the idea somehow that we're going to determine in the academy what human fulfillment and pleasure consists of and prescribe it to people strikes me as hubristic. And really what it is simply an attempt to cover the fact that we're trying to advance what we find pleasurable and enjoyable by way of making a sort of phony objective argument that it's necessary for personal development. I mean, philosophers might like to think that they can distinguish higher from lower pleasures. In utilitarianism, Mill famously maintains that the pleasures of the intellect and higher sentiments are higher than pleasures of mere sensation, and that human happiness only is possible through the former and never through the latter. But these arguments are inevitably question-begging or circular, and as I've just said, they do little more than advance the philosopher's own taste. And this is a point actually that Leo Tolstoy made when he rejected theories of art based on beauty. He said all of these theories are is an attempt to justify and enshrine aristocratic taste. That's all that they are. Let me close with a few closing remarks. I want to say a few things about why I think this is so significant, why I think the topics are important, and maybe to clear up any potential misunderstandings that may have inadvertently. I should have done this at the beginning since I think I chased a few people off. Look, no one should leave this talk today with the impression that I'm against liberal education, or that I think ill of the classics of art, literature, philosophy, and theology that make up the Western canon. My whole life has been devoted to the study of these things. Nothing can be farther from the truth. In fact, it's really out of my love for this tradition and course of study that I feel compelled to speak out as strongly and aggressively as I have. In my view, the integration of this curriculum into a system of universal mass education has done it enormous harm. By administering it at the level of general education, which is typically provided by way of distribution requirements, it has been fragmented and watered down to the point that it is largely ineffective. By forcing it into ridiculous utilitarian roles, like those described by the professional competence and virtue and civic virtue arguments, it has been distorted into such a caricature that is barely recognizable. Moreover, our students, not to mention our colleagues in other disciplines, see these arguments for the cynical shams that they are, and this causes them to become cynical about the Western tradition of arts and letters, the result of which is that we become a kind of pitiful welfare case on campus, and we make it less rather than more likely that our students will ever want to engage this tradition again once they've left the campus. If you're this cynical about something, you can be sure that everybody else is going to be cynical about it. Lastly, the declining economic fortunes of our country in the sense that this decline will be long-lasting and perhaps even permanent. In my view, our nation's economy has been fundamentally unsound for decades, pretty much since the disintegration of industry in the United States and the creation of this phony finance-grounded economy, which you just simply, the only thing you make is sort of you sell the same loan over and over again. That's really been what our economy's been for the last 30 years. The fact that these declining fortunes look like they're going to be long-standing and perhaps even permanent makes it impossible for me to continue to support the system of higher education that we currently have, which, as we've seen, only exists because of liberal education. That's the only reason we have the current system of universities and colleges that we have. If universal post-secondary education is going to be necessary for individual success in the present and the future economies, which I believe it is, then it can no longer take its current grossly bloated and expensive form. Post-secondary education is essentially professional education, and it had better be efficient and short if it is to be affordable for everyone. In such a context, where the question of people's capacity to earn a living is at stake, the idea that we would sustain large numbers of liberal arts professors on the flimsiest of pretenses, that we would in effect support a kind of welfare program for teaching arts and letters, is frankly one that I find repulsive. I'd rather go sell real estate. Go work with my father. I don't have to teach philosophy. I can read philosophy on my own. I'm satisfied then if for the most part our subjects are returned to private life, where in fact they have always most belonged. I am sympathetic with those who fear that thus resigned, our cherished books and works of art will largely disappear because of the appalling state of literacy amongst American youth. And I suspect that for those who are not merely acting out of selfishness, this is the real unspoken reason for their desire to keep liberal arts at the university. They know that if we don't have it there, they're not going to be anywhere. Okay? I'm very sympathetic to that. But this indeed is a problem of primary and secondary education. This is not a university issue. This is an issue of how we educate people from kindergarten through 12th grade. And it is one that cannot be remedied by the maintenance of a bloated and irrational system of post-secondary education, regardless of